going to try to explain one more time articulately why it does not seem like the economy is free falling, although as we are all experiencing, the economy is very actively free falling, right? It's because a lot of the metrics that they're using to say whether or not we're in a recession, an economic crash, all of those terms is through the stock market. We have such a wide division of money in our society at this point. There are so many people that have, not so many, there are enough people that have made it to the upper echelons of billionaire and even high millionaire that they can kind of by themselves end up keeping the stock market somewhat afloat by just pumping and pumping the numbers and pumping all of their money into it. But no matter how difficult it is to afford to be alive and how much those numbers are continuing to increase for all of us that are in that economic realm that we need to be concerned about it, which is most of us, the metrics for the stock market are what is used to determine a recession, a depression, all of those buzzwords.
If there's one thing I can have you take away from this video, and no shame at all to this creator, but as an economist, the number one rule of economics is that the stock market is not the economy. Economists and how policymakers determine if we are in a recession has nothing to do with the stock market. Now, this creator brings up a very interesting point that I want to talk about in this video, and that's this idea that we are experiencing two different economies for two different segments of the population based on socioeconomic status. Now, a lot of television folks and personalities tend to use the stock market as a metric of the economy, but it's a very flawed indicator for several reasons. The majority of which is the fact that most companies are not listed on the stock exchange. It's only very large companies. In addition, we know nothing from the stock market about how well farmers or hairdressers or restaurants or businesses that are not on the stock market are actually doing or functioning. So the economists in these agencies that are determining whether or not we are in a recession don't look to the stock market because it's not a representative sample, which is exactly the reason why this creator points to not using the stock market. But I just want to be very clear that economists are not pointing to the stock market and saying, yes, we are in a recession, or no, we are not. What they're primarily using, among other metrics, is GDP, right? They are looking at real GDP and seeing whether the economy is growing, right? Whether GDP is positive or whether the economy is contracting and GDP is negative. And as we know, GDP is the measurement of all of the different factors of the economy. In general, GDP is measured by taking the sum of consumer spending, government spending, investment spending, and net imports and exports. And if we look at what GDP has done over the last year, what we will see is that at least in Q1 of 2026, real GDP grew by 2.1%. And what's really hard, right, about estimating GDP is that it's hard to do so in real time, right? We only really get official estimates of GDP a quarter, right? So 3 months after that GDP has already been captured. Now, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta does have a real-time estimator for the next GDP estimate that we will receive for Q1 of 2026. That is currently measuring as of July 20th when I'm making this video at about 1.7%. And while there's no official definition for economists about a recession, the general rule of thumb is that if GDP is declining by 2 consecutive quarters, that gives economists a pause to see that the economy is contracting. However, I want to bring up a point that this creator makes indirectly, and that's that both wealthy people and non-wealthy people are experiencing two economic realities that are very different from one another. And in economics, we have referred to that as a K-shaped economy, right? Where the two economic outcomes of these groups has diverged. And we see this in the economics data and the economics numbers because there's a recent study that came out that said that consumer spending, right, which is 2/3 of GDP, about the majority of that, a little over 50%, is being controlled by the top 10% of income earners. So the top 10% of income earners are driving the majority of consumer spending, which is driving GDP going up. So it makes sense that a lot of Americans would feel very disjointed from seeing the economics numbers or the stock market in the way they are seeing them. That's why the numbers look so disjointed, right? Because we're taking the average, right? We're not stratifying, right? We're not breaking apart GDP, looking at wealthier Americans versus non-wealthy Americans. And similarly, we don't measure other key economic metrics, stratifying them by what people earn or what income bracket they belong to. Things like unemployment, for example, we do stratify it based on the type of job you get, but not based on where on the income ladder you fall. Similarly, when we're talking about things like inflation, like CPI or PCE, we are measuring that based on one general basket that has nothing to do with what wealthier people buy versus what non-wealthy people buy. So apart from independent economic analysis, we don't have this like long-term trajectory of data that looks at whether or not people of different socioeconomic statuses are experiencing a recession or not experiencing a recession for themselves. And that's ultimately, I think, where a lot of frustration comes from. Anyways, this was just meant to clarify some of the information in that other video. And as always, I'm happy to answer your questions. So just let me know and I'll see y'all later.